Can trees talk? It sounds like a question that a kid might ask, but it's actually a really interesting one for scientists to investigate. And there's been some surprising findings in recent years that have helped us understand how trees communicate with each other and why they do so. But before we get into what those findings are, let's take a step back and consider what we mean when we say that trees talk. When people talk, they use sounds to convey information between one another. But if you were just listening to trees rustling in the wind, you wouldn't be able to make out any meaningful messages. So instead, when scientists say that trees talk, they don't mean that they do so with sound waves. You see, trees need to exchange information with one another in order to coordinate certain activities. For example, trees can warn each other about impending danger by releasing volatile organic compounds into the air, which we'll refer to as their chemical language. And they can also send information through underground roots via shared mycorrhizal networks, which is the name for the web of fungi that connects the roots of different plants. This underground network allows trees to exchange carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus with one another. And research has shown that trees will send more resources to their neighbors when they sense danger. But whether they actually use these networks to communicate information or just respond to changes in the environment is still an open question. And while we may never know exactly what trees are saying to each other, researchers have made some intriguing discoveries about who trees are talking to. A 2019 study published in the journal PNAS reported that when threatened by insect attack plague, cottonwood trees were more likely to activate their defense mechanisms when the leaves of nearby trees of the same species were removed, which scientists think means that the trees were less likely to warn their neighbors because they assumed that they would not need the warning. In contrast, when leaves were removed from nearby trees of a different species, the black cottonwood trees were much more likely to activate their defenses, suggesting that they used the removal of the leaves as a warning sign. So, trees seem to be able to distinguish between nearby trees of the same species versus those of a different species and adjust their behavior accordingly. But can they do the same thing when it comes to distinguishing between close relatives versus more distant ones? To find out, a team of scientists led by Monica Gagliano at McCary University conducted a new experiment. They grew up to 6 saplings of 4 different plant species in pots over a period of 9 months. The species included to pairs of close relatives, tomato and potato, and eucalyptus and blue gum, as well as to distantly related species, oak and fig. The researchers then subjected some of the plants to water stress by withholding water for 3 weeks to simulate a drought. Then, they analyzed the chemical signals that the plants released into the air to see if the amount of signal varied depending on the relatedness of the plants. They found that the most closely related plants released the fewest warning chemicals into the air, which the researchers suggest may be because those plants assumed that their relatives would already be prepared for the stressful conditions. Plants that were more distantly related, on the other hand, triggered the release of more warning chemicals. The authors note that this does not necessarily mean that the more distantly related plants were more stressed out themselves. Rather, it could just mean that they were better at recognizing threats and communicating them to their neighbors. Overall, this experiment supports the idea that plants can recognize their relatives and tailor their communication accordingly. And this ability seems to extend even to plants that belong to different species. In a previous study, scientists found that when a leaf was removed from a closely related tree, tobacco plants were more likely to activate their defenses against insects only if the leaf came from a plant of the same species, but not if it came from a plant of a different species. And that wasn't just true for plants growing next to each other. Even plants separated by up to 2 meters were able to distinguish between neighboring plants of the same species versus those of a different species. Since the new study showed that plants could tell the difference between close relatives and more distant relatives, the researchers decided to expand on this work by exposing the plants to elevated levels of carbon dioxide to see if the relationship between relatedness and communication would hold up. They found that when grown at elevated levels of CO2, plants of the same species took up less carbon dioxide. But when grown with plants of a different species, they took up significantly more. And this pattern held true regardless of whether the plants were closely related or more distantly related. So, being surrounded by plants of a different species seems to be a good strategy for ensuring that your own plants take up enough carbon dioxide, regardless of whether climate change is a factor. Now, all of this research shows that plants are quite sophisticated when it comes to recognizing their neighbors and tailoring their behavior accordingly. But what does it mean for plants to recognize something? According to Monica Gagliano, recognition implies a memory trace, meaning that there needs to be a way for the plant to store information about its neighbors and then retrieve it later on. In humans, recognition generally requires encoding information into the brain, storing it there, and then retrieving it when needed. However, plants don't have brains, so they must use some other method to recognize their neighbors. Instead, plants may use epigenetic modifications as a form of memory. These are chemical modifications to DNA that do not change the genetic code itself, but affect how genes are expressed. Gagliano's lab is currently investigating whether plants use epigenetic modifications to recognize their neighbors. If they do, this would be an example of plant memory that doesn't rely on the brain. And it would also help scientists understand how plants make decisions under uncertainty, which could help improve crop yields in the face of climate change. But regardless of how plants manage to recognize their neighbors, this research helps us appreciate the complex ways in which organisms interact with one another. Who knows? Maybe someday we will even be able to understand what exactly they are saying. Even though trees may not literally be talking to each other, the science behind how they communicate is anything but silent. This episode was brought to you with the help of our patrons. If you would like to help support the channel and all of the amazing research that we cover here, you can go to our support page to learn more. Thank you for watching and listening, and thank you again to our patrons for making this episode possible. All of our backers receive exclusive access to our monthly live Q&A, where I get to answer questions submitted by our viewers and listeners like you. This month's question comes from a supporter who asks, what was the most surprising fact you learned while researching for this platform? Well, did you know that pineapples used to be rented as a symbol of wealth and power? People would rent them just for a single night so that they could put them on display during dinner parties. It was also common for wealthy individuals to keep pet monkeys, which they would dress up in clothing and accessories that matched their own. Now, that's a perfectly wild fact. If you would like to submit your own question for our Q&A, you can do so through the link in the description below, and I'll see you next time.